Hello everyone and welcome to Inclusive Education at the Crossroads. My name is Philippa Gordon-Gould. I'm co-author of this book, which explores effective special needs provision in global contexts. I wrote this book with my colleague, Professor Gary Hornby, when we both realised that an important conversation needed to be had about the implementation of inclusive education. Gary was able to complement my experience of other countries with his own in very different parts of the world. Although much of our work was drawn from in-depth examination of global research publications, between us we were able to share and compare our personal experience of living and teaching in 7 different countries. Our book explores to what extent inclusive education is a successful global movement, and whether it achieves one of its key stated aims, to bring about a more equitable society. The book considers the discrepancies that exist between the global aims and the national implementation of policies for special educational needs within educational systems around the world. We explore how these policies have perpetuated many unintended consequences of the inclusive education movement. The book starts with a review of the historical background to the development of inclusive education ideals. It describes how important critical initiatives which began in Western education systems in the 1970s were aimed at previously institutionalized children and bringing them into normal education. One of the most significant landmarks was the internationally influential publication, the UK 1978 Warnock Report. This marked the first comprehensive review of special education in the UK, and was the basis for subsequent legislation over the next 45 years. It emphasised the rights and the roles of parents, recognising that 1 in 5 children had some degree of special educational need. It suggested that special education provision should be integral to general education, as opposed to being separate from it. However, the way in which it would be implemented in practice had not been worked out. The International Treaty at Salamanca in 1994 was the first international agreement regarding the educational provision for children with SEND. It was principally intended to address the problem of 350 million children worldwide who were not accessing any form of education. It promoted the idea of including children with special needs into mainstream education without strictly defining the meaning or its extent. The precise intention and meaning of the agreement was interpreted in different ways amongst different countries. Essentially, it also appeared to offer a cheaper alternative to maintaining special educational infrastructure required by special schools. 30 years after her original report, Baroness Warnock updated her views, expressing serious concerns about the implementation of some of the policy ideas resulting from it. She concluded that inclusive education should be rethought and redefined, but her warnings were largely ignored at the time. So how did inclusive education become associated with a child's human rights? In 2006, most countries signed up to the UN Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Treaty, the UN CRPD, in which Article 24 effectively linked the concept of full inclusion to the protection of the human rights of the child. It was gradually ratified by most countries between 2016 and 2020, despite many having reservations. In 2016, an addendum to Article 24 was reportedly forced through by influential leaders on the UN CRPD committee, despite significant disagreement at the time. It aimed to cement the rights of all disabled people to education within fully inclusive mainstream settings, without exception. But the conflation of human rights with fully inclusive education was unsubstantiated by research evidence. It's particularly interesting to look at what inclusive education looks like around the world. Since the signing of the UN CRPD, the extent to which inclusive practices have been adopted by different countries has varied according to the context of their economy, their culture, and their history. The state of New Brunswick in Canada set the most uncompromising example of full inclusion anywhere in the world, fully promoted by the UN as a model for others to follow. It involves all children with all types of SEND and all degrees of SEND being placed in mainstream classrooms. The geographical context of the New Brunswick model is important, as the sparsity of population may well have been a factor in this development. After 30 years, its effectiveness as a role model is still heavily criticised. This is a philosophy taken to its illogical conclusions, to the detriment of all children with and without SEND. Significantly, other Canadian provinces have not adopted the New Brunswick model and still have special schools and special classes. What about what's happening in Ireland? Ireland, which has a highly comprehensive special education system, was one of the last countries to ratify the UN CRPD Treaty in 2018. Since then, the University of Dublin conducted a consultation exercise with a range of international experts about whether they should adopt the New Brunswick model by closing all special schools and special classes in favour of all children, without exception, being placed in mainstream classes. The study exposed the chasm between the ideology and the implementation of inclusion. Our book considers the diverse ways in which inclusive education has developed and impacted a range of countries offering very different levels of inclusion, including Italy, Spain, Portugal, Poland, Germany, and Australia. Research into effectiveness of inclusive practices in Australia, for example, showed clear evidence that popular opinion supports maintaining some special schools. Our book also looks at two very poor, recently independent countries within the EU. That's to say, North Macedonia and Latvia, which have little option to resist international pressure to develop a fully inclusive approach. The importance of context and suitability are not considered in national policies of inclusion. What about Finland? For many years in the early 2000s, Finland was rated as one of the top countries for education outcomes by PISA tests. The inclusion of ever greater levels of SEND have had an impact in their schools on this earlier success. However, it is interesting to note comparisons made in a recent study between Finland and Norway. Finnish mainstream teachers of SEND are highly trained, have high status, and high levels of autonomy. In Norway, there is an emphasis on avoiding special classes. The focus is on SEND support within mainstream classrooms, where they are supported by relatively unqualified teaching assistants. Under Finnish laws, pupils with SEND can still be placed in special classes on a full-time basis. What were the intended consequences of full inclusion? One of the key aims was to achieve equality of opportunity. Another was greater social acceptance of children with SEND. Teachers would become experts in managing all types of SEND within the classroom. National standards would rise. There would be a reduction in education expenditure. So what about the unintended consequences? The high number of court cases in England disputing educational provision demonstrates that many parents feel their children are not provided with an appropriate opportunity to thrive in their mainstream setting. A high proportion of children with SEND in this country leave school with few or no qualifications. As a society, we certainly have considerably greater awareness of SEND issues today than we did 30 years ago. However, now we see rising resentment expressed by parents about disruptive pupils whose behaviour is often associated with unmet SEND needs. Parents who can afford to move to a school area where SEND and poor behaviour is less of a concern. There is a lot of disparity in attainment. Standards have been seen to rise in some schools and in some areas of the country, while others have not. There are now more means with which multi-academy trusts can discriminate between the intake within their trust of schools. Apparent improvements in one school are to a certain extent correlated to a decline in attainment elsewhere. The misconception that providing appropriately for SEND within a mainstream class is cheaper than provision in a special school or unit is an illusion. Resources are dispersed widely across all schools in different parts of the country, rather than being concentrated in a few special schools within each community. This effectively means that the overall costs have risen rather than fallen. At least a dozen types of SEND can be present in every school, affecting up to 20% of pupils in each class. Many well-trained, experienced teachers struggle to manage a diverse range of SEND within their classrooms without the necessary resources or option to make recommendations that a pupil should be offered a more appropriate curriculum in a more appropriate setting. The impact is severe. In England, so many teachers have left the profession that schools are at times recruiting untrained teachers and teaching assistants, or forced to merge two classes into one. So what about the long-term social impact of inappropriate provision? 25% of the prison population have been diagnosed with learning disorders in this country. That's just those who have a diagnosis. 57% have significantly low literacy levels, no higher than an 11-year-old's. 25% have ADHD. That's 10 times as many as in the average population. We know that exclusions and suspensions disproportionately affect students with SEND. Local authorities in England estimated that 94% of children were missing from education last year. 78% of SEND are from socioeconomically disadvantaged groups. Poverty and single-parent families, many parents permanently relying on benefits. So, what are the long-term outcomes of special versus inclusive mainstream education? It is claimed in some quarters that there is convincing research evidence that inclusive education is more effective than special education. Many other studies contest that claim. For example, 2 longitudinal studies by Professor Gary Hornby were conducted of young people with moderate learning difficulties. The New Zealand study showed that 28 out of 30 pupils who, after leaving their special school with a vocational curriculum, secured jobs in the open employment market. Only 2 went on to sheltered workshops. The North of England study was of young people who were transferred in their last few years from a special educational school to mainstream schools. Later, at an average age of 22, 17 out of 24 young people were unemployed. Only 3 were working full-time. 16 out of 24 were on severe disability allowance, which meant they were deemed unable to be employed. So where are we now, and what is the way forward? The most obvious thing to say is that there are simply no simple solutions to the complex question of how to meet the needs of children with SEND. It needs to be handled by trained, experienced experts at every level, from government ministers of education to teaching assistants in schools. They all need to have a high degree of expertise and understanding. The future of the economy of every country depends upon it. The answer is not simply to lump all difficult children together in an alternative provision, nor is it simply to herd all children together in a mainstream class. SEND in schools should be inspected as a critical part of the education system, attracting equal levels of scrutiny, equal to the safeguarding inspection process that we currently have. Multi-academy trust leaders should be thoroughly inspected and held accountable, as well as school head teachers, for the targeted distribution of funds to support SEND appropriately. Teaching assistants are the people we rely on to do the most critical job of meeting the complex needs of the most challenging pupils. Without them, inclusion would be impossible. In many countries, the whole ethos of inclusion is dependent on the compliance of poorly paid, poorly trained, and poorly regarded teaching assistants. The inclusive movement has done much to improve the quality of teaching in schools, and for that everyone is grateful. But the teaching profession is collapsing under the strain. The criteria governing our system of educational provision should always be whether or not the setting is appropriate to the learning needs and the potential of the child. After many years of unsuccessful attempts to establish an idealistic vision of full inclusion in worldwide education systems, the full inclusion movement has come to a final crossroads. The drive towards increasingly inclusive education can all too easily develop an adversarial culture in which expediency and funding are the primary drivers, not understanding, compassion and accountability. No parent should feel forced to send their child to a school where they know their needs cannot be met properly, where they know their potential cannot be explored, and where they know their child is unhappy. Our book emphasizes that the best way forward is to integrate the best aspects of training, resources, and placement found in models of both mainstream and special schools from around the world. It ends with specific recommendations for policy and practice that will lead to greater equality of opportunity and long-term educational benefit for all. This is a book that provides essential information and background for all parents, teachers, and education leaders to draw attention to the realities of providing for children with SEND in our present school system. It is also for those who believe that inclusive education is the answer to everything, and those who feel SEND is not their problem. It is everyone's problem and everyone's responsibility if we are to enable our school system to be supportive and relevant to the future economic and social success of our society.